here with Jim DiEugenio. He's the author of The JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today, and the publisher of KennedysandKing.com. He's written a 4-part article on the Kennedys and civil rights. And this is part 2 we're going to hear. Yeah, so part 2, you wrote, you called this The Media Spin-Dries JFK on Civil Rights. You talk about 3 different books, and you go into RFK's role and a story about him and author James Baldwin in a meeting that they were all attending to. So, yeah, go ahead and tell us about these 3 books.
Actually, it's 4 because the Stephen Levingston, who wrote this unbelievably bad book called Kennedy and King, borrowed a lot of his book from an earlier book called The Bystander by a British author named Nick Bryant.
Oh, that's right.
So I did all 4 of them, okay? Now, I kind of suspected that coming up to the 50th anniversary of MLK and RFK's assassination and the 55th anniversary of JFK, that the MSM would pull something like this, okay? Because I noted it in reviewing Larry Sabato's book at the 50th anniversary of JFK that he had started in on that. At that time, I wasn't aware of Nick Bryant's book, okay, because that was published in England, all right? So I kind of thought this would be coming down the pike, all right? And so I reviewed these 4 books, and I provided a link to my review of Sabato, but I decided to go ahead and do it in depth because I wanted to show just how bad, just how terrible the MSM is on this issue. You know, they were determined to take away as much as they could from what the Kennedys had done. You know, and I think that there's a subliminal message in there, okay, that they don't want anybody else to do that again. So they're going to try and cover it up the way the Dunning School covered up the horrors of what happened after Reconstruction. All right, so what Stephen Levingston, a sentence out of his introduction, he says, Martin Luther King had to overcome White House mistrust, disregard, and stonewalling before his message sank in, unquote. What a bunch of baloney. Look, from the first day that President Kennedy was in office, he began attacking this problem, all right? And I'm not kidding about that. Because during the inaugural parade, he noticed when the Coast Guard did their little color guard, there wasn't anybody of color in the color guard. And so that upset him. Okay? So that night, he'd been inaugurated that night, he calls up Douglas Dillon, Secretary of the Treasury, and he says, how come there weren't any African Americans in the Coast Guard? I want you to start looking into that. Okay? And that's what began. See, JFK invented affirmative action. Not very many people know that. But President Kennedy invented affirmative action. There was no affirmative action before the Kennedy administration. He started it with that. And then he spread it throughout the entire government. And then he went beyond that, and he said anybody doing business with the government has to prove they do not discriminate in hiring practices. All right? So he starts off his book with a complete and utter falsity. Okay? All right? That's just baloney. All right? Okay, and of course, what happened, what this ended up doing, of course, is that it was Kennedy who actually went ahead and submitted a civil rights bill to Congress, and then it was essentially his brother, RFK, Hubert Humphrey, and a senator from California, Thomas Kuchel, who got it passed. They did what nobody else could do for almost a century. They broke the Southern filibuster. And by the way, do you know how long Levingston spends on that? One sentence. One sentence. Okay? Bryant doesn't even mention it at all. But Clay Ryson wrote a whole book about it called The Bill of the Century. And by the way, and so I have to say, what Kennedy did there, all right, what Kennedy did there is that he arranged a massive lobbying program to give the bill a terrific head start. See, there had been 9 different attempts since 1917 to get a civil rights bill to Congress. None of them worked, okay? And in fact, people in the administration told Kennedy it wouldn't work, okay? This included Harris Wofford, who was his first civil rights advisor. He didn't think it was possible. Joe Clark of Pennsylvania, one of the most liberal senators there was, he didn't think it was possible. Kennedy's chief vote counter in Congress, Larry O'Brien, he didn't think it was possible, and that was 1962, not 61. All right, Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader, 63, he didn't think it was possible. Even Lyndon Johnson didn't think it was possible. Okay, and he had been what they call the master of the Senate. He didn't think it was possible. All right? So when Levingston and Bryant talk about, oh, Kennedy could have got it, that's a bunch of baloney. He couldn't have got it through in 61 or 62. He tried to get a voting rights bill through 62, and it failed. Eisenhower called a press conference and said it was unconstitutional. Think about how dumb that is. Giving African Americans the right to vote is unconstitutional.
Eisenhower did that?
Yeah, he said that. Yeah. Okay. By the way, I got to tell you this, David. The more I read about Eisenhower, the worse he looks.
Wow. Yeah, I did.
Okay. All right. So what happened is that the reason he finally was able to get this through, him and his brother, was that a certain amount of events had to happen for this to be possible. The Democrats got 4 more seats in the Senate beginning in January 1963, and all those seats were outside the South. Okay? The demonstrations in Birmingham began, nationally televised. I don't have to tell you how ugly those were, right?
Right.
You know, Bull Connor and all that stuff.
The dogs and the fire hoses.
Right, yeah, right. Okay. Kennedy had to face off against George Wallace at the University of Alabama. That was nationally televised. Okay, to let those 2 African-American students into the university. Kennedy had to bring in 3,000 Army guys because Wallace had brought in almost 1,000 state police. All right? Okay. Then that night, Kennedy made his milestone speech on civil rights, which no president had ever done anything like that since Lincoln. That same day, of course, I'm sure you know this, Medgar Evers was murdered in his parking driveway, okay, by a Klansman. All right. In August of that year, there was the Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin March on Washington in front of the Lincoln Memorial. JFK then began his unprecedented lobbying effort for his bill, which we'll describe in the second part of this. And then JFK had to be assassinated in a southern city in November of 1963. Now, even with all of those momentous events, you know, which happened in the space of about 10 or 11 months, it still took a year to get Kennedy's civil rights bill through Congress. It was the longest debate in congressional history, with the longest filibuster in Senate history. That's how determined the South was to block that bill, because they knew that would be the beginning of the end of the power structure in the South as they knew it, completely knocking down the whole system of segregation. So when they say that Kennedy could have done this in 61, that's completely and utterly false. Okay? And they avoid all this information which I just gave you. to make their false assumption viable. All right? And by the way, Kennedy never lost interest in this bill, as Nick Bryant says. It's simply not true. Okay, he was determined to get it through. He even told Philip Randolph, I know I could lose the election next year because of this, but I don't plan on turning back now or ever. Okay? All right? So what I'm saying then is, if the main thesis of your book, if Levingston's and Bryant's book, is so weak and unfounded that you cannot even present the counter evidence, then number one, how honest are you being with the reader? And two, what is your book worth? And I would add a third question. Why would you even write such a book? Because as anybody knows who studies this issue, the guy who was the bystander was Dwight Eisenhower. He's the one who decided to sit it out for political purposes. All right? Okay, now, on RFK, the two books are David Margolick's The Promise and the Dream and Michael Eric Dyson's completely mistitled book, What Truth Sounds Like. Those two books mainly deal with Bobby Kennedy, all right, and not so much JFK, all right. The worst part of Margolick's book is that he actually seems to take Levingston's book seriously and says JFK really didn't do a heck of a lot on civil rights his first 2 years. In part two of this, we're going to go through all the things that JFK did. And there's a chart at the end of my part three on this, which I show that JFK, in 1/7 of the time, did about 3 times as much as FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower put together. Okay, it's simply no comparison. So that's just baloney. All right. Margolick actually calls the Kennedys, borrowing from David Halberstam's terrible book on RFK, calls them committed Cold Warriors, which is just nutty. Like him and so many others, RFK had seen Vietnam as a place to take a stand against communism. That's not true. And we just discovered through new notes that in 1961, in the 2-week debate in the Oval Office in the White House, Bobby Kennedy was at those meetings. Nobody knew this before. It's not even in John Newman's book, JFK in Vietnam. Bobby Kennedy was at those meetings, and he kept on saying, we're not committing combat troops. All right? So clearly, he had to have been told that by JFK, or he wouldn't have said it. All right? So I didn't know that. Okay, but it's actually true. All right? So Bobby was not a committed Cold Warrior at the time he was Attorney General. All right? So, but there is some interesting work in Margolick's book, and I actually wrote that if I had to recommend any of these 4 books, that would probably be the one. Okay, the rest of them, just avoid them like the plague. Okay, but for instance, he got this airline reservation list in which the night RFK was assassinated in L.A., both Coretta King and Jackie Kennedy flew to California because they wanted to be on the plane that carried Bobby Kennedy's body back to New York. And I guess that the reason Coretta King did that is something else I didn't know. That the night Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy called up Coretta and asked her if there was anything he could do. And Bobby Kennedy arranged to have King's body flown back from Memphis to Atlanta. He paid to have new phone lines tied into her house because she was getting so many phone calls. And then he rented out a whole fleet of rooms to accommodate all the dignitaries and celebrities coming in for the funeral. All right? And now, if you can, that all happened on the night that King was killed. Bobby Kennedy did all that. But you want to know something else? It got to be past midnight And if you remember, Bobby Kennedy flew into Indianapolis, and he made that great speech. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Right. That's on YouTube. People can.
Yeah. Okay. And so he made that great speech, and Indianapolis was one of the very few cities that didn't go up in flames that night. Okay. Well, at about midnight, after he did all this stuff, he remembered that he had to meet with the students who had arranged that rally. And he met with them. He kept that commitment. They were called the Radical Action Program of Indianapolis. Do you believe this guy? On a night like that, he met with these bunch of kids because he promised he would. Okay? All right. So that was pretty interesting stuff there. And then we have pictures. My friend Al Rossi went to Indianapolis, and we have pictures of that park there.
Oh, yeah, those are some nice pictures.
Those are really, really good. It's called the Kennedy and King Park in Indianapolis. Okay, so, I mean, it's really something to watch those things. All right. Rayford Johnson, the great decathlon athlete, quote, Bob Kennedy knew better than anybody else, better than Martin Luther King, that if something wasn't done to solve the racial strife, that we were in deep trouble. All right. No one could have brought black militants and moderates together as Bobby King could have. As Bobby Kennedy could have. And no American could have spoken to both races as he did. Senator Kennedy proved that color doesn't make any difference. He was, in terms of the Negro, as much a Negro as Adam Clayton Powell, as Ralph Bunche or Senator Brooke. He was as much a Negro as Jesse Owens or Joe Louis, because he did right by people. And I have to say this, I wasn't aware of this. In another book I read, in 1968, during the California primary, the Black Panthers drove him to a rally. That's what I mean. This guy was amazing. Now, the Margolick book has a lot of really great pictures in it. Okay, I mean, it has almost a great picture every other page. It's very profusely illustrated. If you can accept the fact that the guy used to work for the New York Times and that he has to write things like James Earl Ray killed Martin Luther King and Sirhan shot Kennedy, if you can excuse that stuff, then that's the one that's actually worth reading and looking at. Now, Michael Eric Dyson's book just might be the worst of the bunch, and that's really saying something. Okay, first of all, it's not even a book. Okay, this guy went ahead and he put together a series of unrelated essays in small format book with large space in between the lines, and somehow the publisher had the chutzpah to call this a book. Okay? It's not a book. All right. Dyson begins this fabrication with a description of Martin Luther King's funeral in Atlanta. Right there on pages 2 and 3, I thought something was wrong. Because although he describes Thurgood Marshall being there and Richard Nixon, there's no mention of Bobby Kennedy, when we know, what I just said, that he was the most important figure there. Okay? Then he says that Johnson didn't show up because he did not want to drape the service in the controversy of the Vietnam War. What a bunch of baloney that is. Okay? But it shows that he wants to do everything he can to diminish RFK and aggrandize Johnson. Sorry, to anybody who knows anything, that ain't the case. Everybody knows that by 1968, Johnson was at deadly odds with both King and RFK. And it wasn't just over the Vietnam War. Okay? As we'll see in part 4 or part 2 of this interview, Johnson had essentially hijacked JFK's war on poverty and made it into something that neither JFK or RFK wanted to have. And at that funeral, what Dyson doesn't want to tell you is that everybody now understood that with King passed on, and because Johnson had blown it, Bobby Kennedy was their last best hope. That's what everybody was talking about there. Now, King In the film King in the Wilderness, you can see this tension between King and LBJ when King goes to visit the scene of the Watts riots, and he calls Johnson, and he tells the president that you got to do something about the economic aspects of the race problem. You got to give these young kids in the ghetto some hope. But as we'll see in part 2 of this, by 1967-68, Johnson had given up on this. Right? And it's very interesting, I think, to compare what Bobby Kennedy said about those riots versus what King said, because Bobby Kennedy went even further than King did. Okay? He said that there is no point in telling Negroes to obey the law. To many Negroes, the law is the enemy. In Harlem, Bedford Stuyvesant, it has almost always been used against them. Because as you know, I'm sure you know this, David, the Watts riot began over a dispute between an arresting officer and a guy he was trying to arrest. A crowd gathered around. Okay, and then it exploded into a huge 6-day riot. All right, and Bobby Kennedy said that the civil rights leaders had ignored the problems in the North. So the larger population of those deprived in the North had no real leadership. And he also said, and this turned out to be true, that the tactics used in the South, the marches and the sit-ins, etc., those would not work in the North. And we're going to learn later why he knew that, okay? And one of the deepest, darkest secrets, which none of these authors tell you about. Bobby Kennedy had been at work on this since 1961. Now, this makes perfect sense in leading up to the main point of his book, which is this completely mischaracterized meeting between James Baldwin and several other people and Bobby Kennedy in, I think, May of 1963. All right. This was, Baldwin had been sending letters and telegrams to Robert Kennedy. And so Bobby Kennedy met with him briefly at Hickory Hill in Virginia. And then the next he said, why don't you meet with me again in New York and bring some people, because I want to talk about how we're going to attack this problem in the North, because we already have our civil rights bill in Congress now. So let's start talking about how we're going to attack this problem outside the South. That's what he was really interested in. Okay? Well, Baldwin brought several people there. Okay? And there's always been a dispute about who was there and who was not. But let's go with what Dyson said, who Dyson says was there. There were Clarence Jones, who was Martin Luther King's lawyer, Edwin Berry, one of the big wheels in the Chicago Urban League, Kenneth Clark, an illustrious social scientist, and Bobby Kennedy was very familiar with his work, Harry Belafonte, the celebrity singer, Lena Horne, celebrity dancer and actress, Lorraine Hansberry was a reporter and a playwright who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, and Jerome Smith. He was an activist for CORE who wrote on the Freedom Rides. Those were the African Americans there. There were 4 white people there. Okay, Baldwin brought in Rip Torn, the actor, and Kennedy was accompanied by 2 of his assistants, Burke Marshall and Ed Gutman. Since it was an informal meeting, there was no stenographic record. So we have to rely upon secondhand accounts. By most accounts, the Attorney General started off the meeting by describing what they had done so far in the South. And that, of course, was supposed to be a segue to what they were going to do in the North, because Bobby was going to define the differences and probably resent some of the work that he had done on this already. Well, it never got that far. Jerome Smith shattered any kind of rapport by bursting out and saying that being in the same room with Bobby Kennedy made him want to throw up. Now, that's a good way to start a discussion, isn't it?
Right.
Okay? Here you are. You have all these illustrious people there. A great opportunity to go ahead and talk about problems that you're going to have to solve in the North. And he says something like that. Now, before why he said that and why he was wrong in saying it, none of these books ask the most pertinent question. What was he doing there? What was Jerome Smith doing there? Because the subject was supposed to be breaking down discrimination in the North. What did Smith know about that? Smith was born in the South. He was a member of the New Orleans aspect of CORE. And he wrote in the Freedom Rides. That problem had already been dealt with. By the end of 1962, the Kennedys had eliminated segregation in buses and bus terminals. All right? So what was Smith doing there? Nobody asked that question. Now, the reason he said that, of course, was because of what happened with the Freedom Rides in 1961. And RFK, he seemed to be striking out at Bobby Kennedy. And that, of course, when that happened, that kind of turned it into a competition. All right? And so people sided with Smith. All right? And Baldwin encouraged it. Hansberry actually said that Smith was the guy that they should be listening to. When in fact, now you see this is the problem that Bobby Kennedy had. Their bill was already in Congress at this time. He'd already gone ahead and remedied the problem of the Freedom Riders. So what was she talking about? And Dyson is such a cheerleader for Baldwin that he never even ponders the fact that Smith might have been wrong in his lashing out at Bobby Kennedy. All right? One of the things that Smith said was that Bobby Kennedy's men stood around taking notes while he was being attacked. That's not what happened. It was the FBI that stood around. And what makes that worse is that the informant the Bureau had inside the Klan coven that performed the assault had actually told Hoover a week in advance that it was going to happen. That information never got back to Bobby Kennedy or Burke Marshall, his assistant. You know, when Bobby did learn about the attacks, he sent two of his men to the scene, John Siegenthaler and John Dorr. Siegenthaler got clubbed and ended up in the hospital. Dorr got on a nearby payphone and started describing what was happening. And when RFK realized what was happening, he sent in 500 U.S. Marshals to keep order under the command of Byron White. You know, as Bobby Kennedy said more than once, he did not know the Freedom Riders were going when they did. All right? He once said that he learned about it in the newspapers. And in fact, when the Freedom Riders were in the North, like Virginia and North Carolina, there wasn't any notable disturbances. It's when they hit the Deep South, okay, and Mississippi and Alabama. That's when it happened. And this was, as he also said, this was something that was pretty much unprecedented. He and Burke Marshall were on the phones willy-nilly trying to find ways to save the situation so nobody would get killed. All right? You know? And so the attacks, but it's even worse than that. And this is something I really can't excuse Dyson. See, it wasn't just J. Edgar Hoover's fault. Because, of course, if the Justice Department would have known about this, they could have got into court with the Fifth Circuit, which I wrote about a lot in this, okay? The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals was an incredible gathering of progressive white Southerners who were on JFK's side. See, and if Bobby Kennedy would have known about this, he could have gone in court before it happened and got an injunction. And that would have then prevented the attacks and then provided for an escort across the South. See, that's what King did in the Selma demonstration. Okay? He forced LBJ to provide, troops to protect him to his march to Selma. And that's what Bobby Kennedy would have done. All right? So as Harris Woolford wrote in his book, Bobby Kennedy had met with some of the civil rights leaders in April, a month before it happened. They asked him about that very issue, when interstate transportation could be straightened out and the segregation signs pulled down at the terminals. There had been a recent Supreme Court case which had been handed down to the Kennedys. Of course, Eisenhower didn't do anything about it. All right, and so he was applying now for the Interstate Commerce Commission to go ahead and apply the order. They were notoriously slow working. All right. Well, as Harris Woolford said, he was at that meeting. There was a representative from CORE there. Nobody told Bobby Kennedy that the freedom rides were going to happen. You know, as their leader, Jim Farmer, later explained, quote, our philosophy was simple. We put on pressure and create a crisis, and then they react. Okay? Now, in other words, if Smith should have been blaming anybody, he should have been blaming his own organization. Okay, the first edition of Harris Woolford's book was released in 1980. Are we really to believe that Michael Eric Dyson never read that book? All right. Based upon that false information, everybody started, attacking the attorney, the guy who had done more than any other attorney general up to that time. Okay, they even jeered him when he said that we helped King in Birmingham, which he did. He did. In Birmingham, what they did is they raised bail money, secret bail money. Okay, they monitored King's treatment while he was in prison. Okay, and then they sent Burke Marshall down to negotiate the settlement. All right, and so they just didn't know any better. All right, some people have said, and Dyson tries to say this, that the meeting somehow helped the Attorney General by sensitizing him. I disagree with that because at this point, Bobby Kennedy had been working on this for going on 3 years. Okay? Nobody had ever, no Attorney General, or President for that matter, had ever done as much for the cause, as John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy did. I think what this meeting did is he now realized that if he was going to do anything on this issue, the people he were going to have to consult with were people like King, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, and later Cesar Chavez on minority rights. Because Baldwin was so misinformed. He once even verbally attacked Joseph Rao. And no Washington lobbyist or lawyer had ever done as much as Joe Rao did. And he attacked him in his own house. He verbally attacked him in his own house. Even somebody as moderate as Henry Louis Gates, who became first a reporter and then a scholar, and liked Baldwin. And by the way, Baldwin made him a character in his last play. He even said that, as a civil rights leader, Baldwin just did not have the grasp of his own role, nor his own message. And when this was discovered later, he was, quote, relieved of his duties and shunned aside as an elder and retired statesman, unquote. And by the way, that is what happened. Okay? And after reading several books on Baldwin, I would have to agree. Or he just didn't have the emotional or mental stability to be any kind of civil rights leader at that time. Even his biographer, who's very sympathetic, David Leeming, understood that point. I mean, after 67, 68, Baldwin was siding with people like Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, and Rap Brown. All right, and he predicted there was a new emerging black consciousness made up by those people that would be the end of America. All right, I could go on and on from the things I learned about Baldwin, but just let me say that Dyson's got it all wrong, and all these other writers like Larry Tye have got what happened there all wrong, and either they do this out of ignorance or they do this out of an agenda. Okay? All right. By the way, Dyson is such a lousy historian. He gives Johnson the credit for the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. This is just ridiculous. Clay Ryson's book, which I mentioned, The Bill of the Century, proves that Johnson did very little to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. All right? he proves with some very good research that it was Bobby Kennedy, the Department of Justice, Thomas Kuchel, and Humphrey who passed that bill. The Voting Rights Act of 65, we know how that happened. That was because of the Selma demonstration, which I believe was King's greatest achievement.
Hmm.
Okay, so he even wants to take that away from King and give it to Johnson. All right. The Fair Housing Act, that was an expansion of JFK's Fair Housing Act in 1962. Johnson submitted that in 1966. He couldn't get it through until 1968. And you know how it got through? Because King was assassinated.
Hmm.
That's how it got through. I mean, this guy's dangerous, you know. I mean, really, really, really bad, you know. But let me say one last thing about this before we end this part one. The worst thing about Dyson's book is I guess he's become kind of a so-called race expert on the left. On the 50th anniversary of Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! Devoted her whole program to Dyson and his crappy book. Okay, so in other words, the Bobby Kennedy who got the 64 Civil Rights Act passed, who came out against Johnson's mad pursuit of the Vietnam War, who faced off against Wallace at the University of Alabama, okay, who ran one of the greatest progressive campaigns for president in the last 50 years, or I'd say even longer than that. You know, the greatest, I believe, progressive campaigns, okay, since Roosevelt, I believe, well, actually, since 1964, okay, actually 60, were Bernie Sanders, Jesse Jackson, and Bobby Kennedy's. That was all ignored. Amy Goodman wants to give us Mr. Dyson and his completely lopsided view of his argument with James Baldwin and Jerome Smith. And he also wants us to ignore all the good, and this is what gets me mad about that. You know, all the good that couldn't come out of that meeting is Smith and Baldwin were not there. What a disgrace. And we'll talk about that in part two, because I go into all the things that JFK and Bobby Kennedy were working on. They had done a lot of work on the... See, this is what makes them so remarkable. Even before they submitted the Civil Rights Act, okay, in 1963, they were working on phase two. That is, assaulting the ghetto, getting rid of the causes. Okay, and that's a story that almost nobody knows about.
Great. No, that sounds... I do think it's interesting. Why do you think so many people are eager to give credit to Lyndon Johnson for these things? I mean, considering what Johnson did in Vietnam, he really almost collapsed the possibility of any of these programs being possible. And he inflamed, I mean, he was operating the kind of the COINTELPRO stuff. He really inflamed the situation. By the time he was done, the situation was a complete shambles. Aside from the bills he had passed, the racial tensions were through the roof. Vietnam was raging. There was no money. Why are people wanting to give him credit for these things?
I think number one, a lot of people don't do the research. They don't dig beneath the surface. Okay. And I think a lot of people, because in the establishment and in the MSM, you know, I think that there is a move, like I talked about here, to somehow denigrate the Kennedys. That's a whole show we could go into about that whole issue. I've written a lot about that. You know, and then to make the Great Society the saving grace of Johnson's presidency. Okay? Because if you take away the Great Society, there really isn't a heck of a lot to Johnson's presidency. Okay? because you know, the guy, by the end, you know, he couldn't get reelected. He couldn't even really, the reason he pulled out is because McCarthy almost beat him in New Hampshire. And then the first reports he got from Wisconsin, which was the next primary, was that he was going to get destroyed in that primary. Okay? So that's why he went on TV and he said, I'm not going to run again. His presidency really ended up, well, and I go into this. See, he set the stage, if you really want to look at it in facts, he set the stage for the breaking up of the FDR coalition, that coalition of voters that the New Deal put together. Because of these, what we're going to talk about next, these horrible riots that went on from 65, 66, 67, and 68, plus the escalation of the Vietnam War, that was essentially it. And that's what caused what you mentioned earlier, the things like SDS, the anti-war movement, okay, and the radical black movement, like SNCC, Students for a Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so I think historians and the media, okay, they want to give these things to Johnson in order not to say that Johnson's presidency ended up being pretty much a disaster in a lot of different ways.
What was Johnson's reaction? I mean, this gets away a little bit from what we're talking about, but I think you kind of alluded to it when you were talking about who was at King's funeral. What was Johnson's reaction to Martin Luther King's anti-Vietnam War speech and that anti-Vietnam War side he was adding to his civil rights discussion?
Well, what happened is that once King began attacking the Vietnam War, Johnson kind of became best of friends with J. Edgar Hoover, because we know what J. Edgar Hoover was trying to do.
Right.
Hoover was trying to drive a wedge between King and the Kennedy White House, and when he issued that dossier in October of 1963 against King, because he put out this white paper slamming King, calling him the most notorious liar in America, Bobby Kennedy forced him to withdraw all those things. Okay? Well, when King started attacking the Vietnam War, Johnson essentially hooked up with Hoover, and he tried to play those sex tapes that the FBI said were of King in these hotel rooms, and getting them, he tried to sell them to Ben Bradley. Ben Bradley wouldn't write about them. Okay? And so he also began, as we know, COINTELPRO operations, and also that's how MH started.
Right.
The CIA's illegal domestic operations, because Johnson wanted to get as much information he could that these movements were all communist inspired. Okay, so he could smear them. And so that's what Johnson ended up doing. He became to be, pretty much enemies. And the other thing is, as the Vietnam War escalated, and he began spending more and more money on it, he began spending less and less money on the war on poverty.
Right.
We'll talk about that later also. See, Johnson ended up being pretty much alone, because by that time, almost all of Kennedy's advisors had left. People like Pierre Salinger and George Ball and McGeorge Bundy, they had all left the administration. Okay? And King had broken with him in 1966. So, Johnson was pretty much, a lot of people think that, Johnson went a little bit, off the rails. I won't get into that. There's been books written about that. I think that one of them is called, The Mental Breakdown of Lyndon Johnson. I'm not going to go that far. But a lot of people think that he was really kind of unstable, in the last couple of years. So, the way he conducted the Vietnam War was just a disgrace.
Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
Just incredible atrocities. I don't. That's what makes it so astonishing that people would try to give him any credit for anything, because he's obviously
And by the way, to give him credit for the Voting Rights Act is taking away credit from King.
Right.
It was King who did the Selma demonstration. There were other people involved. I don't want to give it all to King, but there were other people involved. But the SCLC did a lot to organize that Selma demonstration, and it was that went ahead, and inspired the Voting Rights Act. And like I said, it was his assassination that finally, after 2 years, passed the Housing Act. So this is just lousy scholarship, and it's probably agenda driven also.
Right. No, I look forward to we'll talk again soon. We'll do parts 3 and 4, and yeah, thanks a lot for your time.
Okay, thanks a lot, David. I'll talk to you later.
This is Our Hidden History